core of the film, it's really that message that, exactly, love is the most powerful thing.
Hi, Jonathan. It's so nice to meet you. My name is Sahana, and I'm a writer here at ScreenFish. I'm
Hi,
actually going
Sahan.
to start off by just introducing you here. So, I'm with Jonathan Oster, the writer and director of Jane's Not Here. Once again, thank you so much for your time. We're so excited to have you here and to hear a little bit more about the film. First of all, I'd like to say I watched the film and I loved it. I was like in shock at the ending. I really, really enjoyed the whole script and I felt like it connected with me in so many ways. So I'm gonna get right to it and ask you, what made you want to write and tell this story? Like, where did this idea of this film come from?
Yeah, well, I wish I could kind of take sole credit for it. Unfortunately, I can't. My sister came up with the idea originally.
Oh,
And it
wow.
was just this, yeah, and she kind of came to me with it. And, you know, it's just this wonderful idea, at its core about a mother, trying to make her way back to her child, right? But it was just so mysterious. I mean, for your viewers, the film follows a young woman who wakes up from a coma following this terrible accident. And
Yeah.
upon waking up, she's just totally consumed by memories of a husband and son who, they're nowhere to be found, and who the doctors
Hmm.
assure her are not real. And I've always loved, and my sister and I, we always grew up watching and loving, a good mystery movie where you really have to, put all the puzzle pieces together alongside the main character. And that's
Yeah.
certainly what the case is with this movie. And, I think you mentioned the ending specifically, um, right?
I loved
I,
the ending.
I thank you. Yeah, and the thing I like about the ending, but I think it kind of applies to the whole movie is, you definitely know what's going on and everything like that, and there's
Mhm.
absolutely closure, but there's also just a level of ambiguity to the film in general, the ending and the film in general, which I've always really appreciated when watching movies. I've always really liked movies like that where you
Yeah.
really have to think about it, and it's open to interpretation, and you're kind of pondering it after the credits roll, and that's certainly what we, tried to accomplish with Jane's Not Here.
Well, you did that and it was amazing.
Thank
One
you.
other thing that I loved was the character Jane. It was a very well written character and very strong, but at the same time, you really empathize with her. How did you know that you found the perfect Jane when you met Amelia?
Well, that's a great question, and firstly, I'm giving my sister a lot of credit, but she absolutely deserves it. Yeah, I do think the character is very strongly written, and she's just very funny and charming, and but
Yeah.
a lot of that was actually based on the interactions that I saw between my sister actually and my nephew, so my sister and her son,
Uh-huh.
who were kind of they were more or less the same age as the characters in the film while I was
Right.
writing it. So there's a lot of that same wit and kind of charm, and they have these kind of just really cute conversations
Yeah.
between the mother and son. And a lot of that was based on, what I witnessed and saw firsthand with my sister and my nephew. And then, yeah, in terms of actually finding someone to kind of bring that to life, um, yeah, I found Amelia, and she was kind of based out of New York City as well as Minneapolis, and I'm
Hmm.
based out of Minneapolis, and kind of the entire movie was filmed there. And
Okay.
we just we hopped on a Zoom call. Um, and I just kind of immediately knew. I mean, it just went really well. She captured all of the same kind of characteristics. She was very smart and funny and witty and very bubbly and just really, really caring, which was
Hmm.
very important for the character. And then beyond that, she was just when you're spending 25 shooting days or whatever it is,
Yeah,
with a certain person, you want to make sure that you really get along with them.
of
And we
course.
just got along really well. And she was just so friendly. And yeah, she was the kind of person you'd want around on the set for a 25-day shoot.
Wow. Well, it was a really, really well written script and a very great performance by Amelia. So I really did enjoy that. Another question that I have. So the film started off as like a psychological thriller. When I was watching it, I was like, okay, this is going to be like maybe a little spooky, maybe it's going to be a little like scary. That's how I thought of it as at the start. But later on, we get to this more really deep and beautiful premise of like undying love. What is your take on the idea of love never truly dying?
Yeah, and firstly, just really quick, going back to the start of what you said about, kind of starting off as a psychological thriller, I think that's also one of the really interesting things about the movie is I think
Yeah.
it's just this really interesting kind of hybrid of genres, where it's at its core, it's really a character drama, full of these really
Mhm.
quiet and sad moments as well, but also these really loud and kind of rageful moments, but that's, wrapped around that is kind of a mystery, and then wrapped around that is a bit of a thriller, so I think it's
Yeah.
interesting in that sense. Um, but in terms of the main question about undying love, I mean it's something that I absolutely think is true, and it's also I've thought this more and more since actually having my own daughter. When we were making the film, my wife was pregnant, and at the core of the film, it's really that message that exactly love is the most powerful thing. And then I had my daughter, after the film was made, and that just kind of it reaffirmed everything that I was thinking. So yeah, is that a okay answer to that?
No, that's a beautiful answer. And I honestly, that's I think the part when you got to that part of the actual film, I was like, wow, I never like it was a complete 360 of what I thought was going to happen. And it was just such I think like this story is such a beautiful take on love because no one really ever, talks about what happens like after life. And I think that was such a very beautifully done like script.
I
My
I
other
so
question is
appreciate it.
like
Yes, yes.
yeah, no, I'm so sorry. I cut you off. But how did you actually like approach balancing this idea of a mystery, but then also trying to carry this emotional depth, like of a mother and her son trying to find her son? How were you able to balance both a very a very thriller kind of aspect of the film, but then at the same time you want to add a little bit of emotional depth at the same time? How was it?
I think it all just came down to what I've always loved about watching movies, and when my sister came to me with this premise, I mean, it just seemed right for the opportunity to bring so many things that I love from so many different movies
Yeah,
into this single movie. Um, again, it's about a woman who wakes up with kind of memories that no one else believes, and life experiences that no one else believes she had. And so there was just so much opportunity to bring in, mystery with that, right? And suspense with that as she's trying to figure out, but also drama and great sadness because she's trapped in this life that she doesn't believe she should be trapped in, and she's
yeah,
thinking of another life that no one believes she has. There were just so many opportunities for that. And there was also the opportunity to bring in just big kind of set pieces and kind of vast locations,
right.
including like a moving train and a train station. So,
Hmm.
it really came down to just the kind of movies that I loved growing up with and watching. And
Yeah.
that premise just allowed me the ability to really just blend a lot of things together in a way that I hope is pretty seamless and not jarring, but in a really good way, I think.
It was seamless. It honestly was, and I'm being completely honest when I say that. It was done very well. What were you hoping that the audience felt as they went through like each scene? Because it was a little bit of flashes, but at the same time, it was a little bit of her present. And then it
Mhm.
was a little bit back to like what happened during her accident. What were you hoping? Like, were you hoping to give more goosebumps, or what were you hoping?
Well, first and foremost, I was just really hoping that, everything was balanced correctly. It's a difficult kind of balancing act when we're dealing with, you don't want to reveal too much information to the audience, and you
Yeah,
also don't want them to be too confused about things because again, this is, certainly a movie with, mystery kind of at its core, you know.
right.
Um, so, I just really wanted them to empathize with the character and really go through it. And even the way we kind of shot it was kind of very naturalistic, where you really are kind of a fly on the wall and you're really
Yeah,
observing these people, and I like to use the example of towards the beginning. There's a scene on a train where, it's these two people talking on the train and the camera is just over in another chair, kind of lingering there. And it's
yeah,
almost just like, we're really observing these people's lives. So, I think I really just wanted people to go through the ringer with the main character and feel everything she was feeling, feel the suspense, feel the tension and the mystery, but also, deeply feel for her that she's missing her child, kind of, and she wants more
Yeah.
than anything desperately to get back to her child.
Right, of course. And that's exactly what you did. That was a really good way that you portrayed it. And I do agree with the fact that it felt so natural and raw while you were watching it. You genuinely felt like you were there. Like more than it being like a film, it felt like, oh, I was just sitting there and watching, observing somebody's life. It felt really raw. So
I
that was
I
beautiful.
so appreciate that because yeah, one of the things that we were kind of doing in the there's a type of movie we really liked, or kind of a filming ideology that grew popular kind of in
Uh-huh.
Denmark in the mid 90s, and it's called Dogma 95, and it's kind of this bare bones approach. I don't know if that's
Uh-huh.
the correct term, but it's just you really strip away everything to the story and the performances, and you don't need a lot of fancy equipment, and you don't need a lot of, fancy things. And so we used, one camera, and we used very minimal lighting, and, the lighting we did use, we just used to really emphasize the lighting that was already there,
Yeah.
exaggerate the natural lighting that was already there, because it just really helped ground it. It really helped make it feel like this was taking
Yeah.
place in the real world, even though the premise is slightly surreal, right? Um, so yeah, that's definitely one of the things we did, and I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, of course. I felt that. It just felt very natural. When I was watching it, it felt like I was living in the moment. So that was really great. And this kind of leads to my next question. What would you say was like the hardest part of like writing and directing Jane's journey? Like you're translating your script into like screen work. What were the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it with that final part. It's the translating the script into the screen, and so it really comes in the pre-production. That was the most challenging for me. It's okay. You have this script, you have it all written on a page, but now you have to get the ball rolling to
Yeah.
turn it into this actual thing that
Yeah.
exists right on the screen.
Right.
And so there were a lot of things in the pre-production that were very challenging. And again, it was a very small budget for the film, and because of that, a lot of the responsibilities fell on, my shoulders in particular. So for
Hmm.
pre-production, um, I did the casting and everything, but I also had to secure locations. And I
Right.
I think the most difficult aspect for me of kind of the entire film was securing those locations. It's a lot of stepping outside of your comfort zone for one, stuff that I'm not necessarily used to. It's a lot of cold calling and reaching out to people, and it's a lot of rejections, rejection
Yeah.
after rejection after rejection until you get finally some kind of acceptances or whatever.
Yeah.
In particular, the hospital, finding a place to film the hospital scenes was very challenging. We reached out to a lot of different hospitals, and a lot of places said no, which, I completely understand. And then ultimately, we used a university simulation center. A lot of a lot
Okay.
of a lot of places that train nurses and kind of medical staff and whatnot, they'll have simulation centers that are made to look and feel and act like, hospitals. And so ultimately, we were lucky with a lot of places like that allowed us to film. But in terms of the most challenging, yeah, it was definitely the pre-production, and in particular, getting a lot of those locations.
Right. I know I can imagine like especially like you have a vision and now you need to find a location that fits that vision. That is super challenging. It sounds super challenging, but you nailed it and it was done
Thank you.
very well.
Thank you.
But now I'm going to ask you this question. You're allowed to say no. Were there any parts like any like parts of your script or any scenes that didn't get to make it to the cut? Any deleted scenes that we're allowed to, hear about?
Um, Yes, there was very few actually, which I'm very happy about. But we had, without going into too much detail, that there were, I think maybe one or two just very brief scenes, and those scenes actually came one after another. That ultimately, we shot, and then in editing, we just realized that it wasn't adding too much. There was a little bit more character development, you could say, during those scenes, but it was
Okay.
nothing that hadn't been covered before those scenes and wasn't going to be covered more after those scenes. So ultimately, we just deemed them to be a little bit redundant. And thankfully, we kind of took them out, and it worked quite well without them. So yeah, that's certainly a lesson going forward as well. In fact, I have some other feature scripts that I hope to bring to the screen one day. And after finishing
Wow.
Jane's Not Here, that's another thing that I did is I kind of went back to those and I looked at them and I read them and I determined, well, do I need everything, right? And I
Right.
made some adjustments there as well. So there were a couple of things, but overall it was, quite minimal.
Okay, well, that's good. So we didn't miss out on anything major, which is great.
Yeah. No.
Well, how does it feel for your debut film to see it make it to the big screens? How does it feel?
Yeah, it feels really good. I'm actually back in, Minnesota right now. I just came back yesterday, but yeah, I mean, it premiered at Dances with Films in Los Angeles on Sunday, June 21st. So, as of this recording, just a few days ago. And it was just amazing. I mean, for one, to play at the TCL Chinese Theater was
Right.
just a dream come true. I mean, it's one of the most iconic movie theaters in the world, right? And, I grew up watching movies where the TCL Chinese Theater was featured as a background in some way. Rush Hour in
Right.
particular is one where one of my favorite scenes, the TCL Chinese Theater is there in the background. So that meant a lot. And just, Dances with Films where it premiered the festival. I mean, it's so renowned for championing, truly emerging voices and kind of independent film. And, Jane's Not Here is independent film in the truest sense of the phrase. So, it meant the world, and I think we got a really good response. So yeah, it meant the world. I don't know what else to say besides that.
Well, congratulations. It was an amazing film. And one more thing I would like to ask you is what do you hope that stays with a viewer after watching Jane's Not Here?
Well, it is a great question. It's also something that I'm not necessarily going to fully answer just because I think as soon as I give that answer, that becomes the answer, right? Because I'm the
Right.
director, and what I personally love about films, about art, but about films in particular, is that you can watch it and have a totally different interpretation than the person over here. I think a lot of films tend to be like that, and I think in particular with Jane's Not Here, there's a certain level of ambiguity to it that
Agreed.
I wouldn't really. I think that's the beauty of it, and I wouldn't necessarily want to spoil that by giving my own answer. Of course, I do have an answer to that, and I have a um, I also have an answer to where I think things go after the story ends, after the movie ends and all that. But
Yeah.
I think other people's answers are, just as valid as mine. And yeah.
Agreed. Agreed. And how can someone wanting to watch this film find the film? Where could they find it or follow the film and stay up to date with it?
Well, it's going to be a little bit before you can watch it anymore. Right now the film is just going through the festival route. So we'll keep you updated as soon as we know more. Hopefully it'll be playing in, a state near you, or the state wherever your viewers are watching. Again, we're planning to kind of go all across the US, but I'll certainly keep you updated. And then in terms of, social media, I can send this to you as well, but we have Instagram and it's just Jane's Not Here movie.
Okay, perfect. Well, th those were all my questions, and thank you so much for your time today. Like, I'm really happy that I got to hear like the back end of this story because as soon as I watched the film, I was like, I wish I could speak to Jonathan and ask him where these ideas came from, and my dream came true. So I'm very happy, and thank you so much for your time today.
I super appreciate it. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch the movie, and I appreciate all your super thoughtful questions as well.
Thank you. I, Steve, I think you could stop the recording now because I do want to ask what.